Good morning, everyone. Dr. Jean Fourie here. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion about learning problems, and we are looking at specific learning difficulties and learning problems. So I would like to differentiate between learning problems and SLD, specific learning disorders or specific learning disabilities, because these are concepts that people often confuse, and so we need to have a very clear understanding of how they all function and what all these terms mean. Okay, so when we talk about a specific learning disorder, the word disorder is used in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for classification of various mental disorders. There are very specific criteria which a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a medical doctor need to follow in order to be able to give a child or a person this diagnostic label. When we look at education, in the educational spheres of most countries, they will refer to specific learning disabilities. So people think about these difficulties that children have as a disability from an educational perspective. And if one looks at it from a psychiatric or a medical perspective, they refer to it as a disorder. So we, as teachers, as educators, the diagnosis cannot be made. So you have to refer the child to a professional who is registered with the Health Professions Council and who has got the necessary qualifications in order to make such a diagnosis. So the professional making this diagnosis will follow the following criteria, and there are four main criteria that need to be checked. So firstly, learners who have SLD will experience severe difficulties with their schoolwork. And so this is a specific disorder. The word specific is in there because it is related very clearly to difficulties with performance in academic school things, such as reading, spelling, writing, learning to write, learning to do mathematics. And because of this focus on the ability to learn how to read and to spell and to write and to do maths, it is classified as a specific learning disorder or disability. So that is the first thing. The learner must have very severe difficulties with schoolwork. The second criteria is that there is a clear discrepancy between what one would expect this child to achieve and the actual achievement shown. So this discrepancy is often unexpected. So if you look at all the development of the child, their developmental milestones were reached at the correct ages, their ability to learn language was not impaired. They learned language. So they, to all intents and purposes, the child looks and functions from a developmental perspective until the age of school going at about 7 years old, usually, they function the same as all other children. So you would not know that they have this problem. And therefore, it is often called a hidden disability. It is unexpected. We do not expect this child to be having difficulties when they get to school to learn to do the things that other children learn to do easily, such as learning to read, to decode the text on the page, and to write, and to do mathematics. So there is this discrepancy between what we are expecting and the actual achievement that the child starts to exhibit and to show in school. And so often this disability will only be will only come to the fore. We will only find out about it and see the manifestation of it when the child is in the foundation phase. And so these children might cope with grade 1 and grade 2, and often from grade 3 and grade 4, the serious, if the difficulty is serious, then the teachers will start to see that they are falling behind and they're unable to cope. They're unable to to compensate. So their memory, which served them well, is not able to, you can't just memorize all the textbooks and everything. You really do have to learn to read the worksheets and all the texts that are presented to children in schooling. So this discrepancy between what we expect them to achieve and what they actually achieve in their schoolwork must be very clear. And so these are often children who will be at risk for failing a grade, and they are really starting to show that they are battling with the schooling that is presented. Okay, the third criteria, which is a real difficult one to measure and to determine, and so therefore it does need a psychologist to do some psychometric tests which measure these things, is difficulties present in psychological processing. And the basic processing we look at here are the processes of perception, your ability to see and perceive what is presented visually and orally through ears, through hearing. So perception is impaired. Attention might be impaired. We have to be able to attend to what the teacher or whoever the person is that's doing the teaching. Attention, memory is a psychological process that often has difficulty here. The ability to remember the sounds and the letters and the symbols in maths. And if the memory is impaired, then there will be difficulties with learning. Organizational skills. Often there are issues around. Dave, can you just close the door? Often there are issues around organizational problems and keeping school books tidy and neat. So we will often see that these are learners whose desks are always in a mess, who are unable to follow timetables, who have difficulties with sequential timing, never knowing which class is next, especially when children start moving classes. These learners have difficulty with that. And metacognition. This is your ability to regulate, self-regulate your behaviors, to know when you have learned something, to know what you still need to learn. So metacognition is, meta means over and above. It's your understanding of your own processing and your own ability, what learning you have done. So these children will often not know that they are not learning specific things, and they won't have strategies in place to help them to learn the schoolwork. So those basic psychological processes, difficulties in those areas, we can often pick up by observing children, seeing how they are doing things in classrooms, and if they are sent for a psychological assessment, or if they go to a remedial therapist for any of the reading, writing, maths tests and things that you are doing in the scholastic assessment module, you will also be able to infer that the children are having difficulty with these psychological processes. And then the fourth crucial one is that we need to rule out any difficulties caused by various other things. So if the child has some visual impairment, if they have some problem with their hearing, or any motor disorder, difficulties with movement, with coordination, if there's any other emotional or mental difficulties, so if there's severe depression or there is serious anxiety or schizophrenia or any of the other emotional difficulties, severe school phobia, for instance, or if there are any environmental factors that are impacting on the child's learning, such as poor teaching, or the child has not been exposed to school, or they've been kept at home, or they in a school where there is no teaching happening and no textbooks. So if there are any other environmental factors or biological factors that could be impairing, that could be interfering with the learning, the child's learning, then those issues can take precedence and can be causing learning problems, but we cannot then call this a learning disorder or a learning disability. So we then say that the child has a learning problem, and the learning problem is associated with various other, all sorts of other factors that can be causing or that can be contributing to this learning problem. So there must be no other reason to explain why the learner is not developing and achieving in these academic areas. So there must be no other primary influence affecting the learning process. And so this is a crucial point for the diagnostics of SLD. And often we are finding that learners are being over-diagnosed. So people are saying that the child has a learning problem, an SLD, a learning disability, when there really is just a learning problem. And the learning problem can be caused by a variety of different factors that can have an influence on learning. So we cannot make a formal diagnosis of SLD if the child has any of these other difficulties, because SLD is associated with a very clear organic difficulty. It is clearly related to neurological functioning in the brain, where neurons have not connected certain areas of the brain adequately together. So the oral language component is not connected clearly to the component of the brain that deals with decoding text, or that deals with how to write letters, or that deals with how to do maths. So there are difficulties with the architecture with the neural architecture in the child's brain. And so therefore we call it a hidden disability. To all other extents and purposes, the child has developed oral language, motor development, all their milestones, everything adequately. However, they are just having difficulty learning schoolwork. So there must be adequate teaching having taken place. There must be adequate exposure to text, to pencils, to perceptual work. They must have had all the teaching that's required, and only once that is not working and they are not functioning the same as their peers, then we can say that this child might have an SLD, and one needs to refer them to a person who can do a proper diagnosis. So that is a really important distinction that you need to understand for SLD. Okay, so I'm going to take questions later, but let me go through the slides quickly. The cognitive processes, the 5 cognitive processes that are causing difficulties, interfering with the ability to learn to read and write and do maths: perception, attention, memory, metacognition, and organization. I'm going to go through those briefly. So perception has anything to do with how we are interpreting information that we get from the world around us through our sensory channels. And the primary one is visual. The visual cortex takes up the most space in the brain, and generally the primary way that we receive information and process it is through our visual input. So this is really crucial that vision and hearing are working correctly and are working optimally for the learner to learn. So this is all got to do with how we can recognize the letters on the page, discriminating between a b and a d and a g and a h, all the letters that look the same or are similar but have slightly different orientations. Those can be confusing for learners with a learning disability because their perceptual skills are not at that level where they can decode quickly. Then attention is the ability to receive and process information, and often attention deficit. There's a separate disorder called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that disorder or disability can be comorbid with an SLD, but it could be the primary problem. So ADHD can be the primary diagnosis if there is severe difficulty with attending. So it's the ability to attend to the correct information at the correct time. And so these children are often, if they're very distractible, very hyperactive, definitely not attending to anything that's happening from in the classroom, we can also look at ADHD as a separate diagnosis. And often it can be comorbid with SLD, or one can have ADHD and then learning problems, but because the child is not following the criteria for SLD, ADHD can be the primary diagnosis that is given. So memory involves many different skills and processes in the ability to take information in from the world, encode it into a form that our neural network can understand in our brains. to store that information in the correct storage little compartments in our storage places, to retain it, and to retrieve and recall the information at the correct time in the correct way that is useful for, let's say, writing or doing maths or reading. And so the ability to recall information is part of memory. So learners with a true SLD, a specific learning disability, often there are breakdowns in various places in this memory, in the memory system. So our memory is divided into various different types of memory. And for those of you who really are interested in this, you can go up and read about these different things. So sensory memory, we've got sensory memory that remembers visual things and auditory things. And so it's a very short memory, and then what we need to retain goes into short-term memory, which lasts a little longer. And often this is called a working memory, so that you can, you're remembering some of the things in order to determine which things go into long-term memory. And so long-term memory are our experiences, whether they are consciously learned, which is explicit memory, consciously learned things. And then we've also got implicit unconscious memories, which we are gathering all the time with all the exposures and the things that we are experiencing on a daily basis. There's procedural memory, which is the ability to remember how to do processes, how to do specific tasks. So if you're learning to drive a car, for instance, you are learning procedural memory. So you can learn when to put the clutch in and change gears, and where the indicators are, and how the wheel turns, and you will become automatic. It'll be difficult to learn at first, but it becomes an automatic process later. So if you've been driving for a long time, your procedural memory for learning a car will be embedded in your entire neural network. So that's how to do specific tasks and procedures. And then declarative memory is learning of facts and events. And so these are specific things that you need to explicitly, consciously be taught. And that's a lot of what we're doing at school. We are teaching very specific concepts to learners. And our declarative memory, it can also be divided into two sections: semantic memory, where we are learning about specific concepts and facts. Semantic has got to do with meaning, so meaningful things, and we're doing this all the time in geography lessons and history lessons and English. We're teaching about facts and concepts. And our episodic memory is our memory of events and experiences that happen in our lives. So when you have a birthday party or an important thing happens in your life, that event will be learnt as part of memory, and it is called episodic memory. So it's important that we understand that there are various different memory systems, and they are playing different roles, and there can be difficulties with various parts of the memory system for learners who have specific learning disabilities. And then the fifth crucial component is metacognition. And this is the ability to monitor and evaluate your own performance, your own understanding of what you have learned, and to take your past learning experiences and your past information and to apply it to learning new things. So the ability to identify and select skills and techniques which will facilitate the acquisition of your own information. So let's say you're presented with a lot of content and you have to go and study it. How are you going to get through a big complex book? How are you going to make your own summaries that are useful for you? So choosing or creating the settings in which you are most likely to receive material accurately. So some people like to learn in a quiet space, other people like to learn with a bit of background music. So deciding how you learn what is good for you. Meta means over and above. Identifying the most effective and efficient ways that you can process this information. Some people need to write things down numerous times. We know that repetition is important for neural memory. Some people might only need to write something down once to remember it. Other people might need to write it and read it back to themselves and read it to somebody else and write it again in a different color. So there are various different ways that we can know that we are learning something. And then the ability to evaluate whether you've learned something and to adapt your techniques to different materials and different situations, because different subjects need different ways of learning. So these are all got to do with your metacognition, your understanding of how your own cognitive processes work best. And we know that children with SLD often have organizational problems, and so they have difficulty organizing their thought processes, difficulty with their organizing the classwork that they need to do, with deadlines, with making sure that they start tasks early enough, with doing assignments, and organizing their own environment. So often these learners will need help with ensuring that their timetables are clear, so they know exactly which class they're going to, where the classes are, which books they need for which day, whether they need to pack in their sports clothes or not on certain days. These are the children who will often have things left at home and who will not be prepared for things because they procrastinate a lot, and procrastination is also sometimes an indication that there's an underlying learning problem, that instead of tackling the task and getting to it, there'll be all sorts of other distractions and things that they will be doing. So assisting children with organizing their environments, with organizing the work that they need to learn, is part of how we assist children who have an SLD. And then emotional and social development is often a secondary problem that children with SLD have. Because they have difficulty with learning to read and learning to write, this can also, and all these other metacognitive processes that are difficult, can also interfere with the ability to be social, to understand emotional cues, to interpret social behavior, and to respond appropriately. So we will often find that these are the children who might become bullies on the playground, might be very disruptive in classrooms because they are showing they're doing things to distract from the fact that they cannot do the schoolwork. So often these are secondary difficulties that are displayed because the learner is having an underlying learning difficulty. Okay, so learning disabilities is a term that can include a whole lot of other different kinds of disorders and difficulties. I'm going to go through these very briefly and then stop to take some questions. So there's dyslexia. The lexicon or lexia relates very specifically to words, to text. And when a child has severe difficulties with decoding and learning to read, then we can say that they have dyslexia. But it does, as I say, all of these require very specific diagnostic tests to be done by preferably a psychologist who knows which tests to administer. Dysgraphia, graphemes are the actual squiggles, the alphabet written on the page, or equal signs, or plus signs, or numbers. So the actual things that are on the page are the graphemes. And so a child who has dysgraphia has difficulty with writing down the numbers and the text. And so you will see this with children who have extreme handwriting difficulties, very illegible handwriting, sometimes very slow and laborious, and difficulty with actually putting their ideas on the page, with conceptualizing the thoughts that they have and putting it into order. Dyscalculia is severe difficulties with maths, particularly concepts of mathematics, the operations, the ability to understand numbers and what numbers mean, and to add, subtract, do the operations with numbers, to estimate numbers, to figure out things like geometry. So a child who has severe difficulty with that might be diagnosed with dyscalculia. And then aphasia is very specific, related to difficulties with oral language. So these are difficulties with speaking, often severe difficulties with fluency, with articulating words correctly, and word finding problems with, they know the word, they've heard it before, but you know that like it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't remember the word, but severe difficulties with this. So aphasia is often a disorder that needs to be referred to a speech therapist, and speech therapists are the ones that would diagnose an aphasia problem and assist the learner, the person, with strategies to help with that. And then dyspraxia is now called developmental coordination disorder, and this is a severe difficulty with the feedback that your muscles give your body. So it's got to do with the person's motor functioning, movement with walking, holding a pencil, feeling where their body is in space, coordinating precise movements. So often these people will have difficulty coordinating the movements around speaking because they can't feel where their tongue is and your mouth in order to make to speak. So they need help with learning to do that. Difficulties with writing, holding a pencil. People with dyspraxia find it very difficult to write with a ballpoint pen, for instance. They need a very soft, thick, large pencil, preferably one of those triangular pencils. Difficulties with often with walking, feeling where their feet are on the ground. So these children often are referred to as clumsy children. They will fall upstairs and downstairs. They can't judge where their body is in space. They get hurt on jungle gyms, and they will often avoid lots of rough and tumble play because they just know they're going to get damaged. And so DCD is fairly common, and it's often underdiagnosed in children. We often find that because people don't really know about it, it's underdiagnosed by occupational therapists and by medical doctors. But there's a large movement now for people to start understanding that this is a a much more frequent thing that we're finding in learners than previously thought. Okay, so that gives you a really quick overview of various specific learning disabilities. Oh, right. It can also include central auditory processing disorder. If you speak to speech therapists, they will speak to you about these kinds of words. So this has got to do with learners who are having difficulty with their auditory processing in particular. So remember we said that one of the perceptual skills that's a difficulty is perception, the metacognitive psychological skills. So visual perception, but if there's a clear auditory processing difficulty, so the learner has difficulty with processing very specific tasks related to hearing the language and processing the language. The ear functions adequately. If they get a hearing test, they're fine, but the language processing is difficulty. And then non-verbal learning disorders, trouble with understanding the cues that people give, body language, gestures, facial cues, difficulty with that. And this can also be associated with autism. So children who are on the autism spectrum often have difficulties with figuring out non-verbal cues. And visual perception motor deficit. This is not so prevalent. We prefer now to speak about dyslexia because it kind of covers the difficulties that would be in a visual perception motor deficit. So our general umbrella term is specific learning disabilities. And as you can see, there's a variety of different little subcategories, and a lot of these things are overlapping, and a lot of them are one influences another. They are interacting with each other. And so it's really difficult to determine what the problems are that a child might have. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording there and then take a couple of questions.